With this type of book, you can have theories. I have another good one coming up when we get to the Lake Huron side. Several activities inside the Coast Guard station at Whitefish Point as well. My friend Kim stayed there in 2008. She said she woke up in the middle of the night because she felt a child touch her face with her fingers. And she wrote an article for MLive about it, and I remember reading it years ago, and I was so excited when I found out who the ghost was. I said, Kim, I found out what child woke you up that day. It was Bertha. Now, of course, for this whole area, Whitefish Point, all the way down around the coast, is known as Shipwreck Alley because of the countless shipwrecks that happened there, most notably the Edmund Fitzgerald, which went down in 1975, the entire crew lost. Another most noted shipwreck in this area also ties in with Point Iroquois. Now, Point Iroquois is a part of the National Park Service up on Lake Superior, near Brimley. This is the site of a major Native American massacre in the 1600s, and so that's how it actually gets its name. So a lot of spirited activity here may also be attributed to some of those Native Americans who died there that day. But the SS Migrant is of particular note. This ship went down in November of 1919, and it actually started to sink near Whitefish Point, and it drifted down along the coastline and kind of landed in the Point Iroquois area. And it had a crew, I think, of 16 or 17 men who all died when that ship went down. The only survivor was the captain. And he actually climbed in the pilot house thinking he was going to go down with the ship. And when it hit the water level, it broke off, turned upside down, and he actually floated like in it for 2 days until he was rescued in Canadian waters. And he was the only survivor. Now, November, of course, is a rough time on Lake Superior. The first half of the crew, 8 men, were recovered over the course of the next couple of weeks, and there are dozens of newspaper articles out there about it. They were collected by the keeper here, William Burns, and according to one newspaper article, he was paid $25 per floater to bring the bodies to the coroner in Brimley. So the language of newspapers in the early 1900s was really quite interesting to read some of these. We think that we're, tabloid media today. There was a lot of it back then as well. The last 8 men were not recovered until the following spring, when Burns had to chip them out of the ice. They were still in their life vests. Those last 8 men were buried in a mass grave at the Mission Hill Cemetery near Brimley, and there's a historical marker about them today. So some of the spirited activity at Point Iroquois perhaps tied to the men who died from that. But one of the early stories that I heard back in the late 1990s involved a medium who had been walking out at the lighthouse along the beach, and she had this cold blast of air come over her, which is not terribly uncommon on Lake Superior, but then she had a vision. And she went back very quickly to the lighthouse and said, "Tell me about the girl. Tell me about the girl and the bear." Well, in 1949, there was a family living in this area called the Pomeranke family. The dad actually worked in a fire tower similar to this one at Mission Hill, and he lived with his family, wife and 2 children, in this exact house nearby. And in July of 1949, their 3-year-old daughter, Carol Ann, was playing in the backyard when a bear came out of the woods and grabbed her and pulled her off into the woods and killed her. And there was a manhunt. The bear was found and killed actually within a matter of just a couple of hours. But Carol Ann died, and the family moved away within days. But that medium who visited there, and this is not a terribly well-publicized story. It took me a long time to find some of these articles. But that medium had that vision of Carol Ann at the light. And when talking with family friends about it, they said that at some point Carol Ann must have visited that lighthouse with her family, and that she felt it was a place of safety to go, because clearly she's not going back to the house where that accident happened, but that she must have felt home, that lighthouse was some type of home, a safe home for her to be. Okay, now we're over to Lake Huron, our third Great Lake, the last few stories here. This is the old Presque Lighthouse. This is north of Alpena. And this lighthouse had actually a very short life. It was only around from until about the 1870s, and then it was decommissioned and sold off to private hands, and it was going to be turned into a cottage. But in the 1960s, they found out that, you know, lighthouses draw a certain amount of tourist attention. And they felt maybe it wasn't the best thing to put it as your house because people were still coming to that place even though it was private property. So they decided to turn it into a museum. And at that point, they hired George and Lorraine Paris to run the Lighthouse Museum. And so they worked there and lived for 20 years nearby and would come out every day and run the museum and take people on tours. And the lighthouse was a little different than it was today in that at the top of the tower, because it was decommissioned, all of the mechanical things to make the light shine were removed. So, and even at some points, we'll see in a later picture, the lantern room itself is actually gone. And that was in the 1930s. So they came in and they would run tours. Well, George died in the late 90s, and after that happened, strange things started to happen. And Lorraine attributes all of these things to George. And I remember seeing a documentary on some PBS TV show back in the late 90s about the fact that ships traveling through Lake Huron will look over and see a light shining at this point, even though there is no active light there. And that's a kind of a dangerous thing because ships, before we had all of this fancy technology, they would be able to tell as they were traveling during the day by looking at a lighthouse and its day mark of the shape and the color pattern of where they were. And at night, they would look over and each light had its own distinguishable light pattern. White light, red light, on, off, you know, a Morse code type of thing. And so if a ship is traveling and an extra light shows up in the rotation, that makes a chance to throw them off course. And so it got reported by several freighters at the time that, you know, what is this light that's not supposed to be here going? And people in the marina in town will look over and see the light shining. And they went out and they tried to cover up the tower, the glass, thinking something was reflecting. They would put heavy wool army blankets around the outside, but people would still report seeing that light. And Lorraine thinks it's George just making his presence known. Now, I spoke to a group last September in this community of about 80 people, and I asked them how many of them had actually seen the light go off. And probably 90% of the hands in the room went up. And I asked how many of you seen it more than once, and over half of them stayed up. I drove up and down that road 3 times that night, and that light still did not shine for me. We even walked around at the light, including in the basement that night afterward. I was actually with descendants of one of the former keepers, the Garrity's, and we still could not get that light to shine at all. But Lorraine's had countless stories. In fact, about 18 years ago, I sat next to her at the Great Lakes Lighthouse Conference in Alpena. She was the guest of honor, and I was presenting, and so I sat with her at dinner, and she shared all kinds of stories with me. And then when I presented a couple of years ago on the lawn at the lighthouse, she sat in the front row wearing the same dress. And I commended her for being able to wear the same outfit 10 years later, because God knows I can't. But it was funny, because as I was telling her various stories, and I love, Lorraine was great. She reminded me a lot of my grandmother, just spunky. And she sat in the front row, and I was telling the stories. I'm like, all right, Lorraine, if I get any of these stories wrong, just let me know and I'll fix them. She's like, you better not get them wrong. I didn't. It's off the hook. Now, one of the other stories I found online was a TV interview from a station up north who had taken a medium around through the lighthouse, a woman by the name of Tammy Schuster out of Traverse City. And Tammy and I had done some radio shows together around Halloween in the past. And so I reached out to her on Facebook and I said, Tammy, I just saw this interview with you about Old Presque Lighthouse. Can you tell me what happened? And she says, yeah. She goes, I have never seen George, the spirit of George there, but she goes, I've encountered a man by the name of Don Olds. And Don was friends with the owners of the light who had it in the 1930s. And he lived in the area, had a summer home, and he would visit the property frequently. And Tammy says that when she would climb the tower, she would see this man's face when she was there. And then, at first she didn't know who it was, but when she went down into the museum, this picture of him was in one of the photo albums, and she pointed at it and said, that's the man. That's the man who I've been seeing upstairs. I gave this presentation a year and a half ago down in Bloomingdale, and a woman came up to me afterward and she said, I've met the ghost of Don Olds. He saved my life. She said her and her family had a vacation home up in that area, and when she was a teenager in the 80s, they were over there, and as teenagers tend to do, they were messing around inside the lighthouse one day, and she misstepped, which is really easy to do in a lighthouse, right? She misstepped and she started to fall backwards. And she felt two hands on her back push her forward toward the stairs. And when she turned around, that's the face she saw. And she's convinced Don Olds saved her life that day. So, even to this day, these keepers still saving lives, right? This is the Saginaw River Rearranged light. This is located in Bay City. And this one has some great history to it. The first keepers here were Peter and Julia Braun. And Peter was hired as the head keeper. He came in, but right after they moved in, he fell ill and was bedridden. And so she was appointed as an acting keeper. She served in that role for 9 years until her husband died. And at that point, Julia moves up. She's officially recognized by the Lighthouse Service as a keeper. And a few years later, she remarries a younger man by the name of George Way. You want to guess how many years younger he was? 13. I don't make up the dates. It just happens in all the math lands that way. It works in my favor, but I didn't do it. So she gets remarried to George, and almost immediately she's demoted. And he's named the head keeper, and then they abolish her position altogether. Want to know what happened to that husband next? Doesn't she look like she could kill a couple husbands? I have no proof of that. But for years, I have looked at that picture and thought, Julia, you are a sinister-looking woman. One of the husbands died of prostate cancer, so I'm guessing she probably didn't have anything to do with that one. But it was quite interesting when I was doing the research for this one a couple summers ago. I went into the library in Bay City, into the local history room, and I was trying to find out where Julia was buried. And I'm standing around and I'm talking to some of the volunteers there, and this man walks up to me and he's got a shirt on that says Saginaw River Marine Historical Society. And that's the group that maintains the light. The light is now privately owned by Dow Chemical. And this group kind of contracts with them to do some very light restoration and maintenance, although they just got permission in a 5-year plan to totally restore it, like within the last month, so we're super excited about that. But as I'm standing there in the library, this man comes up and he goes, I know about the lighthouse, and I knew his shirt, and I knew the history. I'm like, I bet you do. So I want to talk to you about some of your stories and some of this and that. And I particularly asked him about the cemetery. I said, I know what cemetery, but I don't know where. And the sexton is out today, so I can't really find out where she's at. He goes, I know where the grave is. He goes, if you give me a few minutes, I've got to do some research, and then I'll take you out there. So I said, great, I've got to go across the hall, or across the street to the county building to get death records for those two husbands, because I was still trying to find out what they died of. And when I came back, I followed a strange man to the cemetery. And he showed me where they were buried. Peter's grave is actually fallen into the ground. It's laying flat. This is Julia's. And her other husband is listed on her headstone, which is interesting because he died before her. So I don't understand the dynamic of this whole grave setup yet, but I'm still trying to figure that out. But we started talking, and one of the stories is that in the 1980s, when the Coast Guard took over this lighthouse, the guardsmen would be there and living at the light, and they would hear footsteps and voices up in the tower in the middle of the night, and they would think, well, maybe one of the other guardsmen's up there. They'd go up and check, and no one else was there. And there are all these stories. Well, as I was recounting some stories with Don here, he told me that story, and I said, wow, that sounds really familiar. Hold on a second. I said, well, what's your name? And he told me, and I got my draft chapter of the book out of my car, and I said, read this paragraph. And he's reading it, and he goes, hey, that's my name. I had gotten his story from a third party, and I had ran into him randomly in the library. And it was just amazing. So I started asking him about the ghost. He's the one that had the encounter with the guy that had the story with the guy that had the encounter with one of the ghosts. So I said, well, who do you think it is? Do you think it's the ghosts, the husbands that she killed? Because I keep trying to pass on that theory. He didn't buy it. But he said, no, he goes, I think it's Julia. I think she's heartbroken over the loss of two husbands, and it's her spirit that's still at the light. Well, I got a little reinforcement on that because last summer, this light is only open for tours during the Tall Ship Celebration, which was this past summer. And so they invited me out for the 2 hottest days of the year to sit in a lighthouse with no ventilation, right on the water, muggy, smelly. But I'm inside doing a book signing. So this addition on the back here is the summer kitchen. And the window right to the left of that, I think, was the parlor. And I was sitting with my back to the summer kitchen, just onto the right of that window, doing a book signing. And at one point in the afternoon on Friday, it was so hot. So I went out on the back porch, and I had a can of Sprite. I was out there just trying to get some breeze and take a little bit of a break. And they bring bus groups in on 15-minute intervals. And so people are coming in, people are going out. And as I'm standing back there, a new bus comes in, and I hear this woman yelling. And all of a sudden, this little kid comes running around the back side and is going to go in the summer kitchen. Well, most people, when they get off the bus, they go in the main entrance, which is by the tower. And this woman, who turns out to be his grandmother, is chasing this kid who's running to get into the lighthouse. And he passes me, and I'm kind of watching, and he steps 1 foot inside that summer kitchen. And the first word out of his mouth was, "Ghost? Where are you? I can't see you. Come out and see me." And that little boy ran around that lighthouse for 45 minutes talking to that ghost. And he came up repeatedly, and Julia, the picture I showed you of Julia, was hanging on the wall, and he would point at her and call her the ghost, and then go looking downstairs and upstairs. And Grandma would take him out, and he kept trying to come back in, and he just would not let it go. And in hindsight, I talked to one of my paranormal groups afterward, and they said if I had turned on the audio recorder on my phone and just set it there, chances are I could have picked up some of what he was hearing. Because clearly, if he's carrying on like that for 45 minutes, he's got somebody interacting with him. He's not just doing that on his own and having no basis for it. Clearly, he's 2 years old, 3 years old. I talked to the grandma about it, told her about the ghost stories and whatnot, and she said, well, there's a ghost in my house, and this little boy's sister, who was about 6, was there, and the grandma told me that the sister had her first ghost encounter when she was 4. So clearly, both of these siblings having a gift, if you see it that way, curse if you don't, to those things. But several other people came through and had activity with that. 2 more lights, and we're wrapping it up. This is the Point Out Barks Lighthouse. This is in the tip of the thumb in Port Hope. And this lighthouse is the light where we had the very first female keeper. Catherine Shook took over in the late 1840s after her husband died. And many people have said over the years that they have seen an apparition of a woman dressed in clothing from the late 1840s, early 1850s era walking through the lighthouse. And what's interesting is the building there today was constructed after she died. But she's still there. And when I went last summer, there's also a brick duplex on the property that the assistant keepers live in. And I've been told that that building also has spirited activity, and found out that one of the assistant keepers who lived there lost 2 wives to childbirth while living in that building. And they believe it is those 2 wives that are still at that particular light. And then, so this is our point of arcs today. And then our final light today is the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse. And this is actually the oldest lighthouse in Michigan, dating back to 1825. Anybody ever been out to this one? Okay, it's a beautiful park setting, so if you get a chance, right there in Port Huron. So I'm going to show you the first two pictures actually are not mine, but they kind of set the stage for what I'm going to tell you. Because this is the one that I've actually done another investigation at and had quite a bit of activity when we were there with the professional paranormal group. So obviously you see the tower. The building directly to the right of that is the main keeper's building. And just south of that, or to the top of that, is the assistant keeper building. Down here on the bottom is the fog signal building. I'm not sure about the white one with the red roof. The big white building with the red roof is Coast Guard. The garage-looking building is now offices and the gift shop. And then the white building with the gray roof is the original Fort Gratiot Hospital that they've moved here and are in the process of restoring that. So beautiful park setting. I'm going to give you one more angle of it from here. So we have a photograph that I'm going to show you in a minute that kind of plays into that. So again, assistant keeper, main keeper, fog signal building, and the tower itself. So Motor City Ghost Hunters is one of the more active groups. They had a contract to do investigations out here. And if you go to their website, they have transcripts and audio files of various investigations. And so I was listening and reading those before we went. And actually, we did this investigation after I submitted my manuscript, so none of these stories that I'm going to tell you coming up were actually in the book, so this is nice. So I knew going in that there were two particular ghosts that they had encounters with, one of which was the name of Frank. And when they go in, if you've ever watched any of those TV shows on where they have the spirit boxes and EVP readers and all those gadgets and gizmos, if you go on an investigation with a paranormal team, they have all those cool toys. And they let you play with them. So they've gone in, and in there they will often ask questions like, who's with us here tonight? And you will often get names. And the name Frank has been recorded at multiple different investigations over the years. And Frank Kimmel was a keeper that served there for over 30 years. So when I'm going in that day, I'm going, all right, I want to meet Frank. Or perhaps I want to meet Bob. This is Lighthouse Bob Hanford. He died in 2010, but he was a long-serving docent with the Historical Society and ran tours and clearly looked the part as a lighthouse keeper. So when we went out in October of 18, I was looking to meet anybody, but particularly when we had time to ask for people, I was going to ask if Frank or Bob were there to see if they would come out. So we get there, it's a very cloudy, rainy October day, the last Saturday of October. The photograph on the left is mine. The photograph on the right is my boyfriend's. I'm looking to see if he's in earshot. He was not standing on his head, clearly. The first 4 photos that he took when we arrived that day were of the tower. Every single one of them was upside down like that. No idea why. Maybe it's because he has a Droid or a Galaxy, not an iPhone. That's like how I like to tease him about it. So when you do one of these active investigations, it's really cool because you get to spend you're there for 6 hours. And you get to spend an hour in a different building with different team members and different gadgets and do different things. And so we went to different buildings, and every building we had flashlights that would go off and on, and nobody was holding them, and EVP recordings, and the heat sensors were going off, and we were picking up words, all kinds of stuff. But the interesting stuff was at the very last, the tower was our last building. And so when we went in, it's interesting, given that I'm such a lighthouse person, I can't climb them anymore because they scare the bejesus out of me. Going up is fine, it's the coming down that's a challenge. And I somehow think coming down on a backboard with the fire department is a little worse than coming down a normal way, so I just don't go up in them anymore. And so he gets the job of going to the top of the towers. So this picture was taken at the top of the tower, and this is a normal picture. Almost everybody takes a picture looking down the tower when they go visit a light, right? What's interesting is that the next picture was taken, I think, 8 or 11 seconds later at the bottom of the tower. Now, I don't know any human, who can go down a set of steps in a lighthouse in less than 20 seconds. Do you? Probably a spirit could do it though, right? So this is the photo, and I'm going to actually step down and walk people through this one because it's a little interesting. So this is the photo that was taken seconds later at the bottom of the tower. And not only is it interesting on the timing of one photo to the next, Fred, is the red button the pointer? Thank you. Before I do something really wrong. Okay, so you can see here, this is the edge of the tower, right? You can see the edge of the tower there. You can see the window frame. Everybody with me so far? You can see the stairs, see the shadow. Those are the stairs, and there's the break between the stairs. You can kind of see that, right? Okay, everybody, so those are typical things you would see at the base of inside the tower, right? Tell me why I'm seeing grass and a sidewalk and all the park lights that are outside the tower. Inside and outside at the same time? It gets better. Hold on. So I showed you the layout of the park because here we have the fog signal building lights. I'll go forward and I'll come back. See how they match? If you're standing at this location in the tower, here you can see this is the center beam of the stairs. If you blow out the wall of the lighthouse, that's where the fog signal building is sitting. These are all lights out in the park along the sidewalk, and if you watch, you can see this. You can see the grass in the sidewalk there. You can see a little bit of it there. It's picking up. There's more. So he's taking this picture. I'm sitting in that entryway of the tower. Right here, this shape. What does that look like to you? He's standing there taking the picture. The shape of the phone. It's almost like somebody took a picture of him taking the picture. And in some projections, actually when I spoke in Kalamazoo, they had it was on a TV screen. You can see in some of them, right in here, you can see his hand holding the phone. So I have no idea on a digital phone how you get inside. I mean, it'd be different if the next picture was taken outside, like on a camera, and you had some type of double exposure. As far as I know, this was the last photo he took of the night. So how you get inside and outside less than 20 seconds after being at the top of the tower. Don't tell him that. We've shown this photo to 5 different paranormal groups and no one can explain what's happening in this particular photo. And I don't know, I can't explain it either, but that kind of just shows you some of the interesting things that take place at some of our haunted lighthouses in Michigan. So I want to thank you for letting me share stories. I'll open it up for questions, comments. I do have copies of the book. If anybody wants one, they're $20 cash and $21.20 if I have to use plastic, or if you have to use plastic, I guess. But we'll open it up and see if anybody wants to talk some more.
That last lighthouse, was that Port Huron?
Yes, Port Gratiot. About Carol Ann Pomeranian. It was really hard to find some of those. Newspapers.com was a great resource if you were ever looking for doing research. It's, I think it's $20 a month or something, but I go in and Google all kinds, any article I do or anything I get fascinated with, I'm in there pulling articles and you can clip them and save them and use those. That and findagrave.com I found are 2 of my more fascinating websites that I access. So. Yes?
You mentioned Waugoshance. Have you met Brent Tompkins, owner now of White Shoal Light? That replaced Waugoshance.
Right. I have not met him, but I've been in communication because White Shoal, which is the candy cane striped light, they actually are restoring that, and you can go and stay and do some restoration work. I was invited to do that. But that whole tower height thing, plus that one I had to climb all the rungs of the...
Not anymore.
Oh.
Platform, and you've got a gangway coming up.
Oh, they're making it a little more appealing, but I'm not sure if I really want to go work.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
They are reporting activity.
Yes. And so at the beginning and in the book, the 13 that I picked are just the ones that had the best stories. There are over 40 of them. So it's interesting.